Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Anvita Arora and I'm your MC for the morning plenary. And before we start, and I welcome you for the session, I would like to have a few housekeeping rules. So we are not planning to have any drills, and should any incident happen, please see that the fire exits are located on both sides of the room. We are very excited to welcome you on the third day of the IAEE 44th International Conference in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And, it's great to see all of you back. We've been having excellent sessions for the last 2 days. Just to say a couple of things, after the plenary, there will be a lot of time for questions. We will have a QR code that is going to be put up on the screen, and you're welcome to use the QR code to put in your questions, and the questions will be directed to the moderator, who will take the questions right after our plenary sessions. So the session that we are having today is the pathways to energy transitions. And we all know that, with the ambitious climate goals, the challenge of grand energy transition from hydrocarbons to low carbon has become very complex. And with the COVID-19, the conflict in Ukraine, and so many other issues, we are facing issues of energy supplies being disrupted, the energy prices skyrocketing, impacting food, water, and many aspects of modern life. So this session will explore whether the climate ambitions and energy security can be harmonized, and what realistic pathways could best meet the global and regional goals, while meeting, the aspirations of a very just energy transition. And to take this plenary discussion forward, I would like to welcome the moderator for today, Mohammad Hijazi. Mohammad Hijazi is the Program Director of the Climate and Sustainability Program here at KAUST. He also leads the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Partnership, the CAMP project. His work focuses on integrated assessment modeling, the energy-water-land nexus, the climate change research. And prior to joining KAUST, he worked as a senior research scientist at the US Department of the Energy Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, where he served as a principal investigator. So he brings a very long standing expertise on climate. Mohammad, may I welcome you to the stage, please? And the floor is yours, Mohammad.
Thank you very much, Anvita. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to be moderating this session and what I hope will be an excellent and dynamic conversation. While I get us started, I'd like to ask the panelists if they may join me here at the stage while I quickly introduce the session. So as Anvita mentioned, I'm Mohammad Hijazi, and I'm the Program Director for the Climate Sustainability Program here at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. And this session will focus on pathways to energy transition. And we've been hearing quite a bit about this. Just energy transition that is safe, sustainable, and robust. And as we know, energy security, energy access, and sustainable development goals have been increasingly complex over the previous years. As Anvita mentioned, transition from hydrocarbons to low carbons have been more complex due to the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, and the continued underinvestment in hydrocarbon production, which has led to skyrocketing prices and disruption to supply of energy resources. We're also, unfortunately, still in a world that is still lacking energy access to 13% of the global population, and roughly about 3 billion people still lack access to clean cooking. And on top of that, at the same time, the world is still not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement of 1.5, which will require rapid, deep, and sustained global greenhouse gas reduction. Again, so the energy trilemma is a great challenge for our society and for our generation. And in this session, we will be exploring whether climate ambition and energy security can be harmonized. And the question we're trying to dwell on in this session would be what realistic pathways could best meet global and regional goals in the aspiration of a just energy transition. So before I ask our keynote speaker to come to the podium, let me quickly introduce our panelists. Again, amazing set of esteemed panelists that we have here today. And I won't spend a lot of time going through their long bios. You can actually go and check their bios on the conference website. But let me run through quickly and briefly. First is His Excellency Khalid Abuleif. He's a Senior Sustainability Advisor to the Minister of Energy, His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman Al-Saud. Khalid is also the Kingdom's Chief Climate Negotiator, and he's the focal point for both the IPCC and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UNFCCC, the United Nations Convention Framework on Climate Change. His name is often considered synonymous to climate policy and sustainability in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Next is Her Highness Princess Noura bin Turki Al-Saud. Princess Noura is the founding partner of AEON Strategy, a sustainability advisory firm based here in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Princess Noura is also a co-founder of AEON Collective, a cross-disciplinary nonprofit that advocates sustainable practices for inclusive, equitable development. Princess Noura is a strong voice in shaping the energy dialogue here in the kingdom and abroad. Next, we have Dr. Ken Koyama-san. He is a Senior Managing Director and Chief Economist at the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, IEEJ for short. Dr. Ken-san is well known for his expertise in energy security and the geopolitics of energy. His research in the areas of energy economics, the global energy markets, has been published extensively in national and international journals and books. Next is Dr. Adnan Shihab-Eldin. He's a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. Dr. Adnan is well-known international voice on all energy-related topics. Over the past 5 decades, Dr. Adnan has held numerous high-level positions across many international organizations and national and international organizations like the Kuwait Foundation of the Advancement of Science, OPEC, UNESCO, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, just to name a few. Dr. Adnan is also a recipient of many prestigious international awards and honors, including the award that he received 2 days ago by the IEEJ for his service to the profession, and I believe it was the Lifetime Outstanding Contribution to the Energy Economics profession. So many congratulations again, Dr. Adnan, on that achievement. Last is distinguished Professor Carlos Duarte from King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST for short, here in Saudi Arabia. Professor Carlos is a globally renowned researcher and scientist in marine ecology. He has published extensively in some of the most prestigious international journals, and some of his pioneering work has focused on the roles of ocean-based and land-based solutions as mitigation measures to combat climate change. At this stage, without further ado, I'd like to invite to the podium our keynote speaker, His Excellency Khalid Abuleif, to deliver his presentation and remarks.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thanks for the organizations who invited me here today. Well, let me start with good morning, dear Excellencies and colleagues. It's really a great privilege and honor to be with such members of such an association. I know that you are the basic important element or one of the milestones in making sure that the climate ambitions are going to be built, especially on the economic side, not only the economic side, but also on the energy economy. I think that is an important pillar for our work as we move forward. With that, let me say that for us to build on the discussion today, and especially on the basic pathways that would be needed for us to transition to the future, I think we really need to know the foundation that this work is built on, and how different nations are shaping their pathways to move in the future. So we will start first with understanding where that foundation started and where we are with it. Then after that, we will look at how are we going to build on that foundation into the future and into different nations, making sure that they are aiming to a target that is collectively recognized, but also we have different pathways to move our way forward to that target. And then finally, I'll share with you the example of Saudi Arabia, and I will also help you understand where Saudi Arabia is coming from in their transition path going to the future. So with that, let's move on the first part of this statement. Basically, we'll start with the foundation. Now, looking at where we have started and where we are going to. From the very beginning, we had foundations that have built our work on climate change and how are we going to be reaching our future ambitions that we have set for ourselves. This foundation started in the 1990s, and we have been building a learning curve since then through different agreements and processes that took us almost, right now we're going to COP28, which is 28 years of design on this important instrument and important issue that we are tackling with internationally. Now, those principles, of course, were the basic foundation for us to move and build on towards where we are today. Starting with UNFCCC Climate Convention that was signed in 1992 and entered into force in 1995, where COP1 started. And then from there on, we had a Kyoto Protocol, which is also another trial that we had in that path moving forward. And then finally, we came up with the Paris Agreement, where we think it should be an agreement that is well established, because it had so much experiences to build on and to move us forward to our future aspirations that we had in that Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement should be, by this time, agreement that is mature enough to really carry us forward in the future. And see, the thing here is, how can we make sure that that future is done correctly and that we are really moving towards a goal that we have established for ourselves. Now, those principles, of course, the basic and most important principle is the common but differentiated responsibility. That principle has developed through the years and through the time. First, we started with looking at it from the concept of those who have had historical emission has the responsibility to move the agenda. But as we moved forward, we did not look only at the past emission, but also on the projected future that we have. And we looked at how we can find a way that could help us move this whole world towards one target that we're all going to be reaching one day in the second half of this century. Now, the thing is, this has evolved. And my interpretation, my current interpretation of this principle is basically it is the common but differentiated. And this is, it seems to me at this stage, over all these years that we have worked, it is really based on the sense of responsibility. How each and every nation have that sense in tackling this issue and the determination to make sure that they are doing their contribution into that effort. So that sense is an extremely important pillar that we are building on as we move. The other one is, as you see, the capabilities, respective capabilities. We know that if you have that sense and you do not equip or enable to really make your sense or your commitment to that sense possible, it would not be easy for you to really reach those goals at the end of the day. But a third pillar that is extremely important is where you are in the world, which region you are in, which country you are in, what is your endowment, what is your circumstances, how are you going to tackle those weaknesses within your circumstances and get it more stronger, and how can we use your strength in advancing the efforts that you have built for yourself. So if you don't have that also in their national circumstances, then you really don't have a basis for which you can build a strong agreement as you move forward. So these three pillars they have been really important pillar in building all the three instruments that we have as we moved through the 3 decades that went before us. So those three pillars, as you will see, they will be also shaping us as we move from our agreement in Paris and how are we going to transition in the future, building on the strength that we have. So the second one is that this bottom-up approach. I think if it wasn't for this approach, we wouldn't have an agreement today. And this is why I always considered Copenhagen as a success, and it's not a failure. Because in Copenhagen, we realized at that point that top-down stick type of agreement would not really help us reach our goals and reach also a consensus of the whole world moving together to address this issue. So that top-down stick type of agreements is difficult. They can be done. It depends on where you are and what's the maturity of your economy and where you are in advancing those issues. And there are regions that continued to say that this is the way to go, and they moved in that track. And this is very effective because it is top-down with clarity on how you want to reach those goals. But it would not help us, as a matter of fact, to really bring the whole world in one path to move them forward towards one goal. So we knew at that point in Paris that this is going to be important to think about, and the bottom-up approach came in as an important pillar for us to build on since then and to come up with the Paris Agreement. But with that, the hybrid was extremely important because you still need the top-down and making sure that you can see where you are and you can shape the future as you move forward. And you use it as a guidance for you to understand and better point yourself in reaching the goals that you have for yourself. And we all recognize that such a thing has to be flexible enough for everybody to work with the system in a way to move them forward towards the goal that we have. So the bottom-up approach was an extremely important principle that we have gotten after all the years, especially after Kyoto, because we knew that we cannot bring the whole world in one path to this. Then this issue of, do we focus on energy resources or do we focus on the issue that we have, which is the emission? Now, focusing on the energy resources, this brings us in a very narrow path that we need to find solutions for. But focusing on the emission, that would give you a much more wider path where you can have a toolbox that could really address all those solutions that are possible to bring you to the point where you are, which is the target that you have put for yourself. And this is why, we had currently two approaches that exist in the world. One approach that is, very much implemented by our partner in the EU, which is, the top-down processes that focuses on the move away from fossil fuel, but also the other path that focuses on emission have a much wider scope to it, because it deals, as a matter of fact, with both successes that we have in moving the future towards renewable, but also we do not ignore what we have today, and we really need to find ways and means to invest in them to make sure that they are also helping us move to the future that we have in a much faster way. So the two paths are important, and two approaches are important. And the second approach has been also endorsed in G20, hosted in Saudi Arabia, thanks to KAUST and to this institution, in collaborating with many international organizations, IEA, OECD, IRENA, GGCI, and others, as a matter of fact, to come up with that conceptual framing that has moved us forward in addressing this other wider scope that we have. So with that, and before I close this, are we looking at smaller targets on greenhouse gases or sectors, or should we look at the overall issue? And this is a debate that is happening today, and it will continue. But at the end of the day, we know for a fact that the Paris Agreement asks for climate neutrality. Climate neutrality means all sectors, all greenhouse gases would have to come to a point where we are having that net zero effect at the end of the day. So starting with one and leaving the other could be not a good idea at this stage, because you really need to have great planning as you move in the future. But that debate is happening and still continuing. And we are of the opinion that I think we should tap in all possibilities, all sectors, all possible greenhouse gases, to make sure that we are reaching the goals that we have much faster than what we have put for ourselves. Now, this is basically the foundation part of it. I will now move into the Paris Agreement as a starting point, and how did we view the future on our different transition pathways. And what are the most important elements that is already existing in the Paris Agreement, and also existing for us to see how we can build our future transition pathways. Now, the science has been, we all know, has been a pillar. If it wasn't for the science, as a matter of fact, and basically the IPCC in the 1980s, we wouldn't be having the agreement in the 1992. As a matter of fact, the agreement came out of a recommendation that came out of the IPCC and the science, saying that this is an issue that we really need to think about and put it on our table. And we move it from a science domain to the political domain. And this is where the climate conventions and climate policy started in 1992, building on that scientific recommendation that we had. Now, on the science, it's very clear that a toolbox and the wide scope is extremely important. Of course, we need to have priorities for ourselves, but basically, you need to look at any possibility to avoid emissions. You need to look at all possibility to abate emission. And also, if we're really serious about 1.5, we cannot leave removal behind us, whether it is from a technology point of view or from nature-based solution point of view. All those elements would have to be tackled. All of them are very urgent. All of them, we need to move them fast. Those that are already, that we feel that we can have great handle on them, which is renewable, we should really have to give them the most and utmost priority in advancing them as we move. But that is said, science says we just cannot forget about the other side, where we really have to move technology and efforts to make sure that they are also moving in a path that would really help us reach our final goals. So both pathways are extremely important to carry, and that was one of the main recommendations out of the IPCC Working Group 3 for the sixth assessment report. Now, maturity of solutions is extremely important, and this is where we have always said that we can build solution in dreams. To me, Vision 23 is a dream because at the end of the day, we are looking at a future. If we can attend to, and we can get, and we can approach, then we make everybody's life in this country a much better life. However, if we do not attend it and do not get it, still we'll have somehow a better life, but no harm is included. However, in issues like climate change, I don't think this is possible. I don't think we can live on dreams. And you say, okay, this is the way it is. Why? Because at the end of the day, we will cause harm. And if we are causing harm, I think we really need to be much more practical, much more serious in moving that issue, and also much more practical and pragmatic in making sure that we are tapping into each and every solution that we have on the ground to push that forward. And this is why it's important that we really need to think about making sure that all solutions are there, and if we can tackle them, let's move towards that direction. Of course, marginalization of a resource or such as hydrocarbon or other, I don't think that would help that resource in really bringing that investment and that commitment from many wider audiences or many countries that could really help this if we marginalize it or if we demonize it at this stage, because that would stop their progress in making sure that they can contribute to the efforts at the end of the day. And also it would undermine our energy security as we move in the future. Now, looking at that, the trilemma come into place, and we all know that for us to shape those pathways, for us to have that smooth transition, we really need to have that balance on the different aspects of the trilemma, whether it is sustainability, whether it is energy security, or at the end of the day, whether it is economic growth. Because at the end of the day, humanity would require growth, would require development, and we cannot bring that back as we move forward. So looking at that brings me, so now we know where is the basis and the foundation for transition, which is the trilemma. Trilemma is going to be extremely important for us, and each and every element of that trilemma is going to be very important, because each and every one is going to make us move into a path that would make humanity a better place to be. Now, looking at Saudi Arabia and where did we go from that, and how is Saudi Arabia as an example of building on that foundation and building on also the trilemma and on the foundations that we had. Of course, when we started in 2015, we had, and after we really had the Paris Agreement, the challenge is how can we bring both energy security and make sure that the world is, have that security and sense of that security, but also make sure that we are also moving towards a program that would bring us to a very ambitious goal that we have to implement as we move forward in addressing climate change and our contribution to that climate change. So circular carbon economy came in that discussion, and this is where Saudi Arabia insisted that in G20 that was held in Saudi Arabia in 2020, we really work hard, all of us, the G20 countries, to make sure that, to see how sound this approach is, so that we can create this as a second approach. So you'll have the approach where we can have a much smaller band of resources to work with, and technologies, but we have this wider band with emission KPI as emission as a metric for it to move forward, and that has passed the test as a matter of fact, and thanks God. And this was basically the conceptual framing for it. So CCE was an extremely important point for us to build on, because the Vision 2030 has already built the resilience of this country from an economic bane that they could have because of climate policy. Now, building on from there into the G20 meeting in Saudi Arabia, we ensured that, okay, the wider band is accepted, and we really need to build on it as a way forward. Now, saying that is not enough, and the leadership, His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed said we really need to build on that, making sure that we have something on the ground to move us forward in building that agenda. And this is where we came up with the Saudi Green Initiative. And this Saudi Green Initiative, as you can see, is building in the wider band and with a metric of emission, and looking at all the aspects that we have with the emission reduction aspects. And we have our targets on that, which has basically doubled what we have promised in 2015. And then we looked at what we can do also in the area of trees and nature-based solutions. And we really did have a very high target, so much ambitions that it really, until today, we're just figuring out how we can work it out as we move forward. And then also make sure that protected land is there for us, to make sure that the future is there for us in building pathways to make sure that this is happening. So the Saudi Green Initiative was extremely important for us to move as an important proof point of where we started in 2020, building on the Vision 2030, building on the CCE, and now building on making sure that this is happening in the ground. Now, for us the new target that we have is 278 metric tons of reduction on carbon equivalents for greenhouse gases. This has been an extremely hard vision for us, because we are still building the Vision 2030, and the economic diversification is still on the right way. So we really had to come up with all possible solutions to help us move into that target, while we are moving also on the economic diversification pathways. Four basically issues that were a part of that: hydrogen, and as you can see, it is part of that. Renewable, of course, this is where the most of the efforts is happening. Then we have CCUS and energy efficiency also on the other side, to make sure that all pathways are moving forward. So with that, I just wanted to share with you the Middle East Green Initiative. And this is, as a matter of fact, the whole thinking behind it is how can we, at the end of the day, make sure that even though we are contributing 278, still we can, the rest of it, we can work it through collaboration with other regional partners in this region. And we are working very hard with our regional partner at this stage to make sure that they are implementing their indices and bringing all those enablers for them to carry that forward. So, to conclude, I think basically our basic approach in doing this, as you can see it here, holistic, very inclusive, all possibilities that exist for us, and we do have strength in advancing them, is there and on the table. We also are looking at a balanced approach, whereby that balanced approach would also advance our Vision 2030, yet also meet the commitments that we have for ourselves. But finally, pathways, from a pathway solution, also accelerated two things that is put into that. Number one, pragmatism, and any solution that is pragmatic is a solution that we are carrying forward. Now, also, we're not leaving the dream out. Even our dreams, we are investing in them, making sure that those dreams hopefully becomes reality as we move forward. And a good example of that, so even in the electrification and power generation, we do have 50%, but also the other 50% coming from gas. Right now, no new facility will be built on the gas side without having CCS compatibility and CCS provisions to them. So even that is being approached and done at this early stage. I have to say, without the hard work that His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, that he has put throughout those 2 very short years, with great accomplishments that we have, we wouldn't be where we are today. Not forgetting, of course, the leadership of this country that is making sure at the end of the day that this is the pathway that we're going to take, even with a vision, a very challenging vision like the Vision 2030 that we have. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your presentation. Quite intriguing and also quite comprehensive in terms of how Saudi Arabia is trying to balance between its climate commitments and their development, economic growth as a country, with some impressive commitments. I've heard about renewables, I've heard about gas with CCS for all, new investments, massive investment in CCS, hydrogen, energy efficiency, and some regional engagement as well through the MENA Green Initiative. I think you've touched on a lot of important topics, regional circumstances, all GHGs, removal technologies are quite critical. We need to focus on emissions, not certain technology. Again, we'll come back to some of these elements in our conversation. But let me now turn to our panelists, and maybe if you can also give your reflection on the same question that I posed to Khalid. What realistic pathways could best meet global and regional goals while meeting the aspiration of a just energy transition? And maybe I'll start with you, Princess Noura. I guess in addition to answering this question, if you can touch on or dwell more on the complexity of the energy challenge that we're talking about, and also maybe the last phrase of the question on the just energy transition. From your experience, of how, if you can just drill down and kind of give more shades of colors on the challenge that we're talking about over here. Should be on.
Thank you. In terms of what we talk about when we talk about a just transition and what are realistic pathways, I think for something to be realistic, it needs to be rooted in facts, based on action and political will, right? And if these 3 factors are there, then you can achieve anything. Of course, the circumstances of countries dictate their ability to take action, as Mr. Khalid clearly articulated very well in his presentation. But I'd like to touch on the point that Mr. Khalid mentioned on the Paris Agreement. And I think the brilliancy of the Paris Agreement is specifically in its simplicity and its realization about the complexity of a transition and these transitional pathways, and that it cannot be prescriptive. And if we continue to be prescriptive in our analysis or in our approaches, then we will continue to find ourselves in the cycle that we find ourselves today, going back, moving forward a couple of steps and then taking 10 steps backwards, unfortunately. Now, what the Paris Agreement did is it created a framework for countries to come together to find solutions that are attuned to their circumstances, whether their ability to deploy capital, the fiscal space that they have, and also, more importantly, the social and economic situations on the ground. And that is crucial, and that's what allowed countries to actually come forward, be more proactive in their solutions than their approaches. But also, more importantly, what the Paris Agreement did is that it was more inclusive, and it brought in the private sector, it brought in the financial sector, it brought in the private players, and it brought civil society into the conversation. And that created a conversation that is wider than what's just happening within the negotiation rooms, which is a process in itself, but takes, I would say, more than decades. As Mr. Khalid clearly knows, and his experience shows that it takes decades for that to show up and to drive action. Now, the fact that we have the social aspect and the social component and the fiscal aspect considered and highlighted even stronger, that allowed action. That allowed for societies to move, that allowed governments to move forward and and discuss with their own constituents what are the right ways forward through this participatory approach with their constituents, understanding their needs, understanding the situation, and then designing the policies that are appropriate for their own transition and their own pathways. And it's complex. It will require several iterations. It is not something that is set as in stone. Transitional pathways cannot be by nature static, but rather they are dynamic, right? Maybe I'll stop there and I can elaborate further.
Yeah, thank you very much. I totally agree. They're quite complex and dynamic, and we're probably going to have to iterate as we go along because there's a steep learning curve. Because as I mentioned earlier, to be able to reduce the emissions, again, if you look at the IPCC and the rate of change that we are, some of these scenarios are calling out for, this is much more rapid than we've ever experienced in human history. So again, that's not necessarily a trivial task. Now the question, there are potentially different pathways, and are more realistic pathways. How do we kind of bend the curve as we learn, as we can continue to move forward along that path? And bringing society into the mix is going to be a critical component of any transition pathway to kind of leave nobody behind.
Absolutely. Just to add to that point, I think there's this discussion or this popular narrative that's happening that is completely disregarding the complexity of what we're facing in the energy transition. And I think we all agree that we need to move towards a low-carbon economy in the future, and that's what the Paris Agreement did, and everyone agrees on that. But I think where the disagreement really is, and that's what's creating dissonance, and unfortunately the powerful voices are more prominent in this popular debate, is that the speed of the transition and how fast we can transition away from emitting carbon at an accelerated rate, as well as what are we transitioning towards or away from. And as Mr. Khalid clearly articulated, there are different pathways, and it's not about choosing one technology over another in something that's prescriptive, but it's really looking at what are we transitioning towards? What are we moving to? We are moving towards a cleaner economy, something where greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, where we are taking responsibility and emitters are taking responsibility of this externality that has been created over the years, but at the same time ensuring and maintaining well-being today, in the short term, medium term, and long term. And we've heard this time and time again, yesterday through the discussions, that there's so much focus on 2050 and 2060 and very little focus on what's happening today and the implications of the decisions that happened yesterday or several years ago and today on what's going to happen today, tomorrow, and in the foreseeable future.
Right. Obviously, some of these are pie in the sky, and we need to go on more realistic pathways. Let me now transition to Ken. On a question, and maybe just for the audience, should be able to scan the code and kind of send in any questions you might have. And also for the panelists, feel free to comment on any comment that you've heard from your fellow panelists as well. So I hope this would allow for more dynamic conversation. But maybe for you, Ken, I mean, we've heard that certain countries have already kind of taken the lead on trying to reduce their emissions. Obviously, we have a lot of people lagging behind. Is the transition going to necessarily yield winners and losers? Does it have to be the case? When we, in terms of how we can achieve a just transition and also a realistic transition toward a low-carbon future? Ken San, if you can, yes, please.
Okay, Ahmed, thank you very much for your question. And
if you can bring the mic closer to, please. Thank you very much.
Okay. And firstly, I'd like to thank the conference organizer for inviting me this discussion. And in my view, that the challenge for this energy transition is increasingly become very, very complex and unpredictable and uncertain because of the impact of the Ukraine crisis and the energy market volatilities. So under the circumstance for us all, I think that we need a really pragmatic and inclusive and holistic approach to address this very complex challenge for energy transition for simultaneously address that climate change and energy security. And why that we need to pragmatic and inclusive. The reason is very, in a sense, simple, that all the country in the world and all the stakeholder has a different condition in terms of economic development, energy resource endowment, and technology development, everything. So we needed to have employed all the possible options for this purpose: energy saving, renewables, nuclear power, and even that fossil fuel decarbonization, and negative emission technology, and etc. And which means that probably we do not have any silver bullet option. We cannot rely on the simple Z-path. We should be realistic, and depending on the country's circumstance, we should pursue this very important challenge. And again, the most important issue to me is the pathway and transition. The aim is to protect the global common goods and global stability and global interest. And for this purpose, every country in the world needs to cooperate. And for this year, 2023, Japan will host the G7 summit this May in Hiroshima. And the G7, of course, is a gathering of 7 industrial economies. And Japan is the only Asian members of G7. And which means, I think that Japan needs to reflect the reality of, for example, Asian country. And to do that, we should be realistic about the Asian energy transition. For example, our institute, IEEJ, always try to advocate that for Asia, two-step approach for energy transition can be realistic, starting from the coal to natural gas transition. And the second, that we should, for example, decarbonize fossil fuel. And with this two-step approach, that the overall transition cost can be minimized. And I think that these pragmatic views should be very important in the discussion in the world, just to contribute to the global common goods. And also, Japan, need to promote that dialogue among major player stakeholders, including producer and consumer dialogue, so that the approach should become more inclusive and more pragmatic. And I think that this can be the very important element, so to avoid the creation of winner and loser. I think that this can be a very bad situation because, again, the aim is to promote the global common goods. Mm-hmm. And our institute's analysis also indicates that there is a possibility and a concern over the green growth strategy. If there is no crowding out effect, I think that we can expect that overall growth. But if there is a crowding out, some country become a loser and some country become winner. And we should avoid this kind of unhappy situation. And to do that, every country needs to cooperate, and we should work together.
Yeah, thank you very much. Obviously, climate change doesn't know borders, and its emissions in the global context that what matters at the end of the day, but we all have to be responsible nations and responsible individuals. And I couldn't agree more on the, and I think I see some consensus here. We need to be technology agnostic. All technologies should play a role in it. Khalid, you've come up with, you've touched on this through the circular carbon economy concept, that technology we need to play to ensure that economic growth is, it goes hand in hand with how the transition is happening for all players within the economy, all sectors, all regions, and through dialogue between producers and consumers, we can ensure that hopefully we can make that transition without leaving anybody behind, without having necessarily losers. Now, let me turn to you, Dr. Adnan, and we live in an ocean of pathways and scenarios, and depending on who you talk to, there are always the pathway that certain people are promoting. In your mind, is there a one-size-fits-all? Are there certain scenarios that are, or pathways that are more realistic than others? And also, if you can comment on the broader question, what realistic pathways, same question that I posed to all the panels.
Thank you very much. Of course, when you look at pathways, pathways to what? Pathways to net zero emission, is that what we're talking about?
Sure.
This has been studied, and there are two approaches. One approach is to say, I want to reach there by this date, and you work backward. And that's the approach that has been taken lately by the International Energy Agency. And not only that, but you say, I want to get there, and I want to use this vehicle, renewable only, for example, or renewable first, second, and third, and then I would look. So that's one approach. That's fine. But that's not a global approach. That's an approach for those who can afford it or who think that way. The best approach is the alternative approach, which again determines a number of pathways. What do you do? Even when you're climbing mountains, I climb mountains, you set your goal, but you don't know exactly, especially if it's a complex one, because we know that this is a very complex situation. You want to reach there, but you don't decide on one pathway from day one without leaving yourself the alternative to try the other. So in a nutshell, we know that we can use demand and supply technologies in order to get there. So we should keep all of low carbon emission technologies available today, those that we can develop easily and deploy tomorrow, and those that are still in the innovation, we should also keep putting some money into them in research. That gives us a sort of a suite of tools to use along the way, and as we travel in this pathway, we may have to adjust the pathway. And I said that the first 2 nights ago. We may have to adjust, and actually that's what you do. If you look back at all of the outlooks that started to look at the climate change challenge 20 years ago, if you look at all of them and see what they projected where we are not following those pathways. We have adjusted, and we will keep adjusting. So that's my first thing. In fact, there has been a recent study from Potsdam in Germany, published by, I think, the Washington Post in December last year, that looked at thousands, maybe 1,200 pathways to get us there, to get us below 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. More than 90% of them will have an overshoot or will never get there. So you eliminate the 90%, you focus on the 10%. Only 10% of them will get you there with very little overshoot. So these are good ones. And only a small fraction of those are reasonable. And what do you mean by reasonable? Reasonable that we are already near there. We're not far away from them. So we continue to tweak. So that's really the message, I would say, about the pathways. Pathways, we know where we are heading, but we don't fix the road. And I think that the broader question, is there a pathway for everybody? No, there is no pathway for everybody. And because they are pathway for Japan, pathway for Europe, pathway for the Middle East, pathway for producers, pathway for Africa. In Africa, you tell them a pathway you have to only do nuclear and renewable, it doesn't work. So because each region has the choices of pathways. When you put all of the regions, these choices, you multiply them, they become very large. Then you start looking back at them and say, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this will overshoot, this is not realistic, we're far. And then you get a very small set of pathways that are not predetermined, but you only know the next mile. You don't know the next 100 miles, but you keep saying, you're going in that direction. Okay? But that's really what I think we really need to focus. And that means there is a responsibility for each one of us to play our role, and there is more responsibility for those who put us in this dilemma. Let's not forget that we are in this dilemma because we have been putting CO2 in the atmosphere for the last 150 years. That's the major problem. I know when there is a pollution problem, what do you do to solve the pollution problem? There are 2 things. You stop polluting. If it's a municipal pollution or plastic pollution in the ocean or whatever it is, the first thing you do is you stop polluting. That's a net zero emission. And that's going to take us 20, 30, 40, 50 years to get there. But that's not enough. If you stop polluting and you still have the pollution, you haven't solved the problem. So what do? you design ways, economic ways, to remove the pollution. And so I think we must begin to think about removing the pollution in addition to stopping the pollution. That means carbon dioxide removal, technologies that have to be thought about with the responsibility that goes with it. Whoever put that CO2 in the atmosphere has to take it, or at least take part of it. Take 10% initially, 20%, 30%, 40%. And I think that's when we realize this and agree to it, I think we can accelerate the solution. Instead of trying to force Africa or the producing countries to use renewable or to decarbonize. As Khalid said, each region can do certain things, and we have seen some regions do that, some regions saying that I will wait and see what others will do, because they're not convinced it will get you there. Sorry, I took more time, but that's really
a lot of food for thought, and I totally agree that we often have to be looking at different pathways. We have to be ready to, again, if we're climbing to the top of the mountain, it's good to have a target in mind, right? We do definitely, as society, as residents of planet Earth, be on a trajectory we are more sustainable as human beings. Now, we need to be ready, and we need to keep our options open, because options will be different for different regions, again, playing to different regional circumstances, because one should not be coming at the expense of another societal goal. And as you've articulated, and we've heard from the other panelists as well. Let me turn over to you now, Professor Carlos. Again, same question: what realistic pathways could best meet global and regional goals while meeting the aspiration of a just transition? And maybe if you can touch on how we can minimize some of the risk associated with those transitions.
Thank you. So indeed, a lot of wise thoughts have been shared by my fellow panelists and the keynote speaker. So there's really not much to add. And in fact, we already have the pathways to very clear. So it's a pathway to achieving a balance between emissions and removals by mid-century, and doing so along a pathway that does not overshoot the climate system beyond 2 degrees, and hopefully we can contain it within 1.5. So that's what the path should do. But there are as many paths as there are domestic circumstances. So there isn't really one path that fits all. And in that sense, I think that the quote from the chairman of the Communist Party, then Xiaoping, when China was moving towards a new path, that was an open economy, applies. That is, the important thing is not whether the cat is black or white, it is that it catches the mice. So every path that achieves the goal is legitimate and suitable. But I believe beyond that, there's actually one thought I would like to introduce. And is that when I look at paths, for instance, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or the EU or many other pathways to achieve this, then I see projections that are very smooth and gradual and achieve the goal, but the world is not smooth and gradual. And since the goals were endorsing the Paris Agreement, that's 7 years ago, we had first a disruption in Chile and France due to small increases in the prices of transportation that actually led to the COP in Chile to have to be held in Spain because the country was in social turmoil. Then the country that is the largest cumulative emitter left the Paris Agreement to re-enter again, and then we had a pandemic, and then now we have a war in Europe. So everything but smooth, and this is only 7 years. So how many more black swans or surprises await us in the path to net zero? So the important thing is not just the paths accommodate to national circumstances. The important thing is that the paths are resilient. So last week, I came here to KAUST because I was worried about all of this, the contrast between smooth pathways and the bumpy nature of reality. And I came to KAUST to work with my colleague Noura Al-Mansouri to try to think how we design pathways that are resilient to unforeseen circumstances. And my colleagues have mentioned too that some ecologists, they actually are embedded in the resilience of ecosystem, which is a diversity of pathways. So pathways that have only one solution are likely to fail when put under stress, and also cooperation. So in ecosystems, mutualistic relationships where different species engage in reciprocation actually build resilience. So diversity and and cooperation are important pathways to resilience. But in economy, when we had the global financial crisis, banks are now forced to do stress tests. I wonder if we have done stress tests of our pathways to net zero and what the outcome will be.
Quite fascinating concept of a stress test to the pathways. You've kind of given me a good segue to my next item or next set of questions, where I'd like to kind of shift the conversation now to the solution space, right? So what are the ingredients and prerequisites that we have to put in place to achieve a clean, stable, and sustainable pathway to the energy transition? So maybe I'll start with you, Your Excellency Khalid, and maybe focus on the policy component. You've mentioned that after the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, in Glasgow in COP26, we've seen the completion of the Paris Agreement rulebook in Article 6. We also saw the updated submission of NDCs, the national determined contributions. We also witnessed a flurry of net zero announcements, including one from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Then in Sharm el-Sheikh, the next COP, a lot of people named it as an implementation COP, and I think to many, this decade is perceived as an implementation. In your mind, you've kind of touched on this, but do we have all the policy and regulatory framework in place? And here you can talk globally, but also regionally as well. Or are there some critically missing items or parts of the puzzle that are necessary to ensure that the policy framework is in place to ensure a clean, stable, and sustainable transition?
Thank you, Mohammed. I think really an excellent question. And so we know for a fact that by COP26, we really completed our rule book for the Paris Agreement. And we are really moving it to a different stage. Now, to me, that different stage is extremely important because this is the implementation stage. The implementation stage will bring me back into the three pillars that I was saying. It was very clear coming out of Glasgow that each and every of us have that sense of responsibility. So each one of us, as nations, already have our indices and already have our long-term targets. I think on the other side, it was very clear that these different indices and different targets fully takes into account their circumstances because each and every indice has that integrated into it. Now, the implementation phase would put us into the second pillar, which is the capabilities and enablement. And the enablement will become extremely important in this decade. Why? Because as Dr. Adnan said, are we building the system or are we spending our efforts and money on looking at the target and how we can bring it back into a system that we put for ourselves? I think both of them are important, but building the system is going to be extremely important at this stage. Now, if we look at one major effort, this association can help a lot in the direction and shaping that capability direction, which is energy economics. Why? Because if you look at the system we have right now for greening the financial system, I'm sorry, that system basically brings us into a very narrow path that we have already discussed, which is basically looking at resources, and the target for it is to move away from fossil fuel. Now, if we do not relook and look at the metric of emission and not only think of that narrow band and look at this wider band into where our metric is emission, I think somehow we'll be limiting ourselves and the possibilities that all nations can contribute to this effort. TCFD truly was a great failure for us because it really considered only the move away from fossil fuel as an option, nothing else. And I think investments and also finance, if it does not look at the emission in general and how we can keep it, I don't think we'll be shaping this path in the correct manner. And this path would move away even from the principles we have put in Paris Agreement, which is basically emission, removal, reduction of emission, and removal of sinks. So basically, both of them are not well, in line with exactly what we have agreed to as, facing the capability side of this whole question.
Great, thanks very much, Khalid. And you brought up a very important concept, the issue of finance and the challenge of finance and the transition. As many estimates have indicated that the transition will be more costly to humanity than if we continue on the current path. And I'll come back to that a bit, but maybe this is a good segue to Dr. Adnan. As you know, hydrocarbons dominate the energy system nowadays, and 77% to 80% roughly, give or take. What role do you see for the hydrocarbons? Again, we kind of touch on this, right? Every country should play their own circumstances, and there should not be any particular technology that is casted out as not a viable option. But in your mind, what role do you foresee for hydrocarbon technologies to play in a net zero pathway to a pathway to net zero by mid-century, whatever mid-century, 2050, 2060, 2070, what have you?
Well, I mean, this has been one of the central focus of most studies that look at the pathways and where we're heading and what role for the hydrocarbon would be. I mean, you said we are currently at about 80%. If you look at, for example, the OPEC outlook, next 3 centuries, you see that in their reference scenario, they see hydrocarbons would drop maybe to 70% in their sort of like reference scenario, and in others it will go a little bit more. That's because that's how they see it from their perspective. You look at the IEA, they see it in their extreme scenario, net zero emission dropping to 20%. So the question for the industry and for the users of hydrocarbon and for the global community that worries about climate change, what do we think? Where are we? Are we at 70%? Are we going to heading 70% or 20%? There's a big gap there. And clearly, if you are planning, you should try to reduce that gap from 70%, but you don't expect you're going to go to 20%. So what you should do, I think the hydrocarbon will be there. Obviously, they're not going to be there at 80%. With all of the policies and money that's going on to move into low emission. So hydrocarbon can survive strongly if they are coupled with measures by the producers and by the consumers to lower the emissions. Both sides have to lower the emissions. The producers and exporters like Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries can focus initially on Scope 1 and Scope 2, which we listened to yesterday, to try to reduce the emissions of Scope 1 and Scope 2 in your operation. And yesterday, I think Saudi Arabia had CAPSARC has a very nice index there. And we should press the accelerator pedal there as fast as we can, because it makes sense, because it generates income for a longer period of time, but it helps also other countries, like especially the developing countries. The industrial countries can focus on Scope 3, using hydrocarbons with Scope 3, whatever way. For example, hydrogen, blue hydrogen. There's an interest on both sides, on the producers and the consumers, to press blue hydrogen. And so I applaud Japan, for example, because really they look at it objectively, and that's why they established alliances, relationships, pilot projects between Saudi Arabia and Japan and others. And that's what all consumers should do by reducing Scope 3 emissions. And if they do that, then you will see more reciprocity from the producer side, working with them to reduce the emissions of hydrocarbon by sort of what you're doing is that you're exporting hydrocarbon that already has been cleaned by converting it to hydrogen, capturing the CO2 and putting it down. We know in gas, steam methane reforming, it's a mature technology. It's just a question of cost. and depending on the carbon cost. And if we're going to go in that direction, we're going to have to pay the price. Who's going to pay it? The producer or the consumer? That dialogue will never end. But both sides have to start. So I think I see a role for hydrocarbon. I don't see carbon going down to 20%, hydrocarbon going down %. One way would be, as I said, scope 1 and scope 2. That's our business in the producing country to take care of it as soon as possible. We should work with the consumers in scope 3. And the final method would be, you can export hydrocarbon that has not yet been cleaned directly, but you could take off from the air an equivalent amount of CO2, put it underground, stamp your barrel or your gasoline or what have you. But that, somebody has to pay for it. That's very expensive. And it's not the producers who are going to pay for it. They have the technology, they have the infrastructure, they have the underground storage. Some of the best storage for CO2 in the world is under the empty quarter or the Gulf. There are other places. So I would see hydrocarbon to continue to play a role. There are other technologies for hydrocarbon I haven't mentioned. There is innovation going on all the time. But these are the three main lines for hydrocarbon. They will continue, and that's the way to go. And we will, if we do that, especially between the major producers and the major consumers, we will allow the people who haven't benefited yet, access, affordability, billion, more than a billion, they don't have clean fuels. We will give them access for 10 or 15 years or so more, give them advantage, because they haven't really been part of the problem. But then now that we can make them part of the solution with our help.
Yeah, excellent. And yeah, I mean, the oil-producing nations or hydrocarbon-producing nations working on scope 1 and 2 and reducing the emission out of the whole supply chain to the extent possible is definitely a good strategy. And then investing in some of the removal technology. Actually, I was in attending a workshop organized by the Ministry of Energy on the role of DAC in the kingdom's transition and the interest, again, with the stamp in terms of the permanence, and that you actually know that carbon is stored underground for centuries to come, and that assurance is quite important to ensure that there is no leakage. But obviously, a lot of R&D still needs to be put in place because it's a very expensive technology, and we need to scale that up. So maybe let me turn to you, Princess Noura, on the need for R&D and international cooperation. Adnan, you kind of touched on this, and I think, Ken, you've also talked about the engagement between producing and consumer nations. In your mind, Noura, if you can comment on international cooperation on climate and energy policy with regard to the energy transition.
Of course. I think, just to recap on some of what we've heard today, is what we're seeing is really an aggressive push, right, towards revolutionizing our energy system, the backbone of our economy today. And what we're looking at is not just a techno-economic shift, but also a socio-economic and socio-technical shift that is really driven by policy, right? So you need everyone from society to play a role. And for that to happen, you need cooperation. You need private-public cooperation. You need bilateral cooperation between countries, between businesses, and all of that. And I think we are starting to see that these avenues of cooperation are opening up, right, through bilateral agreements, for example, between Saudi and the EU with the shipment and with the development of a green hydrogen port north of Saudi Arabia. Same thing with the ammonia shipment between the kingdom and Japan. But I think what is missing here is that catalytic effect that is necessary to scale up these pilot projects and these solutions, right? And that would really come with private sector involvement. And for the private sector to really be involved and put in that catalytic capital that is necessary to drive innovation, to scale up these technologies, and to find the necessary solutions, you really need to have strong governance structures. You need to ensure that there are transparency. And when we're talking about implementation, what is important is to have strong governance structures, to have these transparency measures that put in place that avoid room for doubt and distrust, because a big component of of the situation we're in today is distrust. Distrust between those who are calling for certain pathways versus those who are trying to find their own pathways. And because of legacy issues and what's happened in the past, this issue of distrust, and we've seen it at COP27 and we continue to see it today, that this is creating a disservice to the transition, and it's really hindering progress. So if we really focus on having these governance structures, strong policies, regulations that are harmonized across borders, this will facilitate the implementation, even facilitate cooperation between regions. And maybe in addition to that point, one thing I wanted to say is, yesterday someone was talking about how the E in ESG is really hampering some of the investment or flow of finances. And I think that's problematic because I agree, it is. And it's because there's not enough emphasis on the G and S. And when we talk about S in particular, the social component, the social aspects are not considered when it comes, what are the local circumstances that countries face? What are the social circumstances that drive policies, that actually shape policies? And this is neglected. And when we're starting to put governance structures and environmental policies in place, or environmental structures in place, they need to be considerate of these local circumstances. Because as we see it today, we see that developing nations are really held hostage to the international financial system that is not considerate of their local makeup. It's not considerate of the capacities that they have, of the fiscal restrictions that they're facing. And this requires a remake of the international financial architectural system. And we've seen this with the Bridgetown agenda that was spoken and launched in late 2022. And hopefully these discussions will facilitate action and will bring people together and avoid avoid the issues of distrust that we're really all held hostage to today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that finance is a critically important piece of the puzzle, and I'm sure it will be continuously negotiated and discussed in many of the incoming COPs. So there's still a lot of grounds to be covered in terms of how to solve the finance problem, to ensure that nobody's truly left behind and people have the resources to achieve that balance, to ensure that they can continue to develop as nations in terms of economic growth, but also abide by their climate commitment. And you've kind of already touched on the finance. So maybe, Ken, one of the questions, I'm trying to keep these questions coming in, I'm trying to blend them into some of the questions that I have. So we have seen an impressive growth in renewables, and we know renewable is part of the solution, but Khalid, you've already made the point that they're not the only solution. It's going to be a critically important portion of any strategy into the future. But one of the issues that one of the comments is raising here is the critical minerals and the bottlenecks associated with those, the supply chain of achieving those potential growth, because even at the current level of investment, some of the pathways are calling for doubling up of those investment for many years to come. And with the supply chain potential, are we expecting bottlenecks that could potentially put us on a different trajectory, potentially?
Okay, Mohammed, thank you again for asking me a very important question to me about critical minerals. And I'm very happy to share my views based on that IEEJ's latest analysis on this subject matter published last October. Put it very simply, if we promote the energy transition toward carbon neutrality, the demand for the critical minerals and rare earths, rare metals increase exponentially. In some cases, it's quadrupled more than 10 times. And it is indicated that many of the critical materials will see that a very significant supply-demand crunch in the around 2030 or earlier, which means that the higher cost for critical mineral supplies. And not only the supply-demand crunch and the price increase, but the problem, one of the geopolitical implications is we are going to see the very significant overdependence on specific source of supply, both in terms of resource and process capacity. And given the reality in the current world of geopolitical tension and world divide, I think that the critical mineral issues is shedding a new and very important issues for the global energy transition. In other words, we need to expand the concept of optimization of energy transition. If we simply narrow down the CO2 emissions there is a potential, say, solution pathway, but this may not be the optimal solution for the economic security optimization, or it is not the optimum solution for resource sustainability pathway. So we need to expand, or we need to be holistic to address that energy transition. Just we think about that critical minerals. Of course, we need to pursue that maximum effort for this purpose. But again, we should not depend on that one specific option. And probably this will have a very implication that Adnan mentioned, that the role of fossil fuel, the decarbonized fossil fuel with CCS or CCUS can be highlighted under this concept. And also we may have another views on the nuclear technology and others. So I think that it is very important to widen the views on these issues.
Okay, thank you. I see Adnan. I'll come to you, Carlos, in a bit, but go ahead, Adnan.
No, I just wanted to jump in on the issue of renewable. And it's very clear that if your renewable share of your total energy system or total grid is 10%, 15%, renewable in most countries is the cheapest. But as you share rise up, you start having to worry about balance of the system, connectivity, and not just the supply chains and the minerals, but other things, backup batteries, what have you. And we've seen, we study, look at Germany. The policies are fine, and that's why their share has risen over 30%, 40. But at what cost per kilowatt hour to the consumer or to the state? One of the highest in the world. So that has to be part of the studies in the future as you pass this threshold. Now the threshold will change from country to country and region to region. Some countries, their threshold is 10% because they don't have much sun, they don't have much wind. Some countries, their threshold 40% because they have plenty of sun or plenty of wind. And that brings me to the issue is that you have to study the techno-economics of all of the supply chain, and then compare it with the other ones. For example, a lot of people say direct air capture is very expensive. It is expensive. You have to study the techno-economics about the costs and the benefits, both of them. So when you compare in life, when you compare things, you don't only compare cost and cost. You compare cost minus benefits, or benefits minus cost. That's what the insurance company do when they allocate premiums. You study different drivers. And so you have CCS. That's the reason you see, for example, in the US, CCUS is receiving a lot of attention in the IRA and others. And Ernie Moniz Global Energy Initiative is now proposing that the US itself allocate $33 billion over the next 10 years, and then more until they reach 1 gigaton by 2060. Why do they do that? Because they've studied the cost-benefit analysis and they compare it. So I think that's very important.
We're almost out of time, so Ken, I know you probably want to have like
very brief.
20-second intervention. I do want to come to you, Carlos. I have a question that I want to ask you that's come from the audience.
I just want to echo that Adnan point that probably we really need a very comprehensive analysis on the issue related to the intermittency of renewable. That technology best mix should be the key word to address these intermittency, not only through the batteries, but also the hydrogen and the grid capabilities and fossil fuel with CO2-free fuels. All these elements should be considered in a holistic manner.
Right, but I'm also hearing from the conversation that to scale up these renewables, for instance, the critical materials might force you to take a slower path than what some of these scenarios are calling out, which might require a bigger role for carbon removal technologies in what we're seeing as more realistic pathway to the energy transition. And obviously, nature-based solution, Carlos, is obviously one potential. We've heard about DAC and CCS and BECS in general as more of the technology-based negative emission technologies. The role of the of nature-based, maybe one question came on a comment you made about the stress test, that you were mentioning about how to stress test the pathways. So maybe you can comment on that, but also why are we not seeing the uptake of nature-based solutions? What are the bottlenecks in your mind in terms of what are the things that we need to be working on to ensure that they have a bigger role to play in the future?
Yeah, well, let's start by the end of your question. So the bottlenecks are governance and transparency. So nature-based solutions are emerging as a necessary component of the solution. They're part of Remove, as Khalid mentioned, and they're very important, but we are now learning how to govern the deployment of the solutions, how to trade them cross-boundary, and also how to have robust verification systems that build transparency and confidence in the investment on nature-based solutions. But we are focusing on energy, but really the climate problem is a dual problem of energy and food. And when we talk about food, then 38% of the cumulative pool of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere actually comes from what is called in the carbon budget land use change. So that's messing up with ecosystems actually to transform them into agroecosystems. That's 38% of the problem, and therefore it follows that 38% of the solution must come from reversing that damage. And also investing in nature, investing in rebuilding nature and repairing nature adds resilience, and adds resilience particularly to vulnerable nations that are otherwise affected more strongly by climate change and will avoid migratory fluxes and add adaptive capacity to those nations. So I think nature-based solutions is not just a component of removal, it's an essential component to meet our climate goals, but also our biodiversity targets and our sustainable development goals.
Did you want to jump in? I do. We do.
Yeah.
We're over time, so I'm.
So, I just wanted to comment on something that Dr. Adnan said, and I'll segue right into my concluding remarks in the interest of time. It was on the cost aspect of DAC, for example, direct air capture, or carbon capture and sequestration. And I think when it comes to that, the issue of cost and affordability really goes back to policy, right? And if we look at offshore wind, for example, 10, 15 years ago, it was a no-go technology. Today, it's much cheaper than gas or LNG, especially in Europe. So I think that just makes a case for policy and what's necessary. And in the end, when we're talking about this transition, it's not just simply an issue of electrification. It's not as simple as that, right? And it's really an issue of economic sustainability, of political survival, and about social well-being, right? And prosperity in the end. And I think each nation chooses the policies that it wants to apply to ensure all of that. In the kingdom, for example, and I'm sure other oil-producing and consuming nations, carbon capture, sequestration, whether it's or direct carbon capture, is a critical component. And it's increasingly become a more important component globally because of the trajectory that we currently find ourselves in, right? And so that just makes the case for the need to deploy capital. And I think in the kingdom, we have showcased our willingness, and we have showcased our commitments, and this has been something that we've been doing since the 60s, since the creation of OPEC. We have been a responsible player in the global energy system, and we will continue to be a responsible player in the energy system and the global climate debate. Through OPEC, through the circular carbon economy, through the Saudi Green Initiative, and the Middle East Green Initiative. And I think we are proving that we are using our technological know-how, our political capital, our financial capabilities to really drive this transition in a way that is suitable for us, but also suitable for the world.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm being told that we need to actually wrap it up. We're eating up from the coffee break. So I'd like to thank our panelists for the very interesting and informative discussion over here. There will be a round. If you have any questions, please follow up with them. Again, if you can join me in giving the panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you to all the panelists for a very engaging and fascinating discussion. I think the full house that we have here attests to the importance of this panel. I invite you all to join us for the coffee break. And we have concurrent sessions on the first and second floors. Please check the agenda on the website as well as the app. Thank you very much.